Paul Gauguin is quite interesting. He began his adult life as a stockbroker in Paris and decided fairly late in his development that he wanted to be an artist. And in fact, exhibited with the Impressionists in the very last Impressionist show in Paris in 1886. He then left Paris to join Van Gogh in the south of France. Van Gogh's mental instability drove him away, and Gauguin went to Brittany, which we see in the picture on the left, where he's looking for an unspoiled way of life, a place where native customs have continued, where industry hasn't interrupted tradition. And you can see he focuses on these young Breton girls with their clogs, chapeaux is what they're called, and their native headdress dancing in the wheat fields. Spends about 3 years in Brittany looking for this innocent, unspoiled way of life, and then decides to go further afield and moves to French Polynesia in the South Pacific in 1891. Spends about 2 years there, where he paints the picture on your right, while in Polynesia, in Tahiti, and then returns to Paris for a couple of years, 1893 to 1895. At which point he goes back to Polynesia, and he spends the rest of his life there, finally dying in the South Pacific in 1903. What we're going to focus on is one of his most famous works, up in Boston, about 12 feet across and almost 5 feet tall. Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? He began this in 1897, worked on it for the better part of a year. In 1897, Gauguin was having a pretty rough time. His health was beginning to fail. He was massively in debt. He couldn't even afford artists' canvases. And so he's getting packing sacks off of the boats that come to Polynesia. And he's stitching together the burlap of these sacks and using that as the basis for his paintings. He's just absolutely broke. And then in 1897, he also finds out that his daughter has died back in France. He had left 2 children and his wife in order to move to Tahiti. On finding out that his daughter dies and being already kind of in dire straits, Gauguin decides to commit suicide. He drinks arsenic poison, but he's unsuccessful at killing himself. He's incredibly ill, and on coming off of his sickbed, he begins this massive picture. And he intends it really on a meditation, on the meaning of life. What is life all about? And that's what the title refers to. Where do we come from? What are we and where are we going? This is the idea that life is a passage, and we need to reflect on how we got here, who we are, and where we're going next. And for Gauguin, that's an incredibly important message at this point in his life. Now, he wrote a letter to a friend in 1898 where he explains the picture, or talks about it at least. And one of the things he makes note of in the picture are the yellow corners. They have the title in the upper left corner and more details in the upper right. And what he tells his friend is that these yellow corners are included to make the painting look like it's a fresco that was painted over a golden wall, and that the corners of that fresco are damaged, revealing the golden wall underneath it. This, of course, is all artifice, but it helps to explain at least those 2 parts of the picture. He writes to his friend as well about the importance of this picture to him. And here's a quote from Gauguin. I believe that this canvas not only surpasses all of my preceding ones, but also I believe that it will never do anything better than this. He really thinks that this is going to be his magnum opus, and to this day it's kind of remembered as that by Gauguin, his most important picture. The letter then goes on to read the picture, detailing what each of the figures, or where each of the figures are. And what's interesting is that he reads it from right to left, in other words, the opposite of the European tradition. And he starts with the baby in the right corner, the sleeping baby and the 3 seated women in the lower right. He doesn't tell us who they are. He just says there's a sleeping baby and 3 seated women in the lower right corner. He doesn't even mention the cute dog, which for me is a problem. This overview, then, that he continues to give as he reads the painting from this corner across to the lower left, doesn't do much at all to explain the meaning. He really just simply describes the poses. So he follows this up by talking about the fact that the woman in the center is picking fruit. You know, thanks a lot, Paul. I couldn't have figured that one out on my own. He doesn't tell us if she's a symbol for something or who she's a symbol for. Just that there's a woman in the center picking fruit. Still, that said, there are a few enticing tidbits in this letter. So, for example, behind the woman picking fruit, you'll notice that there are two figures in purple, and he mentions those. Two figures in purple, these are Gauguin's words. Two figures in purple confide their thoughts to each other. An enormous seated figure here intentionally violates the perspective. You'll notice that it's too large to be behind the figure picking fruit. So that's on purpose, he says. And this figure, the seated figure, looks in astonishment at these people who dare to think of their destiny. So something's going on, right? The thought process, and maybe a violation of norms by doing so. He continues as he reads left. An idol, he says, both arms mysteriously and rhythmically raised, seems to indicate the beyond, and he capitalizes the beyond, the future, the great hereafter. A seated girl, he says, and this is in the foreground in front, seems to listen to the idol. So we have to imagine that there's a dialogue going on between this girl and the idol behind her. I love the cute kittens as well. Finally, his description concludes with an old woman, he says, approaching death, who appears reconciled and resigned to her thoughts. At her feet, a strange white bird holding a lizard in its claw represents a futility of words. In other words, words don't matter, only thoughts do. And maybe this is why he doesn't really explain much in his picture. Words are futile in explaining meaning. Pictures are better. And he doesn't really want to nail it down. He wants us to think about what it all means. So what do we think it means? Well, I don't know if there's sort of a critical mass on this, but for my money, the picture seems to present human life, starting in the lower right and ending in the lower left. We start with a baby, we end with an old woman, and that sort of makes a nice transition, right? The entirety of life. And if we think about these as the poles of the picture, the two corners, then the baby is where do we come from in the title. The old woman is where are we going? And that suggests to me then that the woman in the center picking fruit and the young girl seated and listening to the idol, this is what we are. Right? Where do we come from? Lower right. What we are in the middle. Where are we going? On the left. And the figure in the center is most certainly, as we've seen elsewhere in works by Van Gogh, is a reference to Eve in the Garden of Eden, picking the fruit of knowledge. This theme of original sin runs strong through Gauguin's work. We see it almost everywhere at one point or another. One of the works we started off with, for example, we know that this figure, the standing figure here, which is Gauguin's island wife, was in fact based on images of Eve being banished from the Garden of Eden after the fall. So it too makes reference to original sin. And we see it not only in his Polynesian works, but elsewhere in Gauguin's work. So, for example, here Gauguin, self-portrait, presents himself as a saint with a halo, perhaps a martyred St. John the Baptist, beheaded. But at the same time, in his fingers, he holds the serpent. So he's the devil, sending the serpent to tempt us. And there are the apples, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, that are there simply to tempt us. In Vision After the Sermon, Gauguin appears as the preacher in the lower right corner, the one who inspires the congregation's vision. But because of the apple tree that runs diagonally through the composition, he's again also their tempter. He is both saint and sinner. He is both angel and demon to these people. And this, of course, fits perfectly with symbolist tendencies that look for the supernatural, the spiritual. the visionary without distinguishing between good and bad. Now, as Gauguin said, this was really the best thing he'd ever do. And he continues to take motifs from this picture and rework them in canvases over the next 5 years up until his death. Here, for example, we see the kneeling figures from Where Do We Come From reworked. We see the idol in the background. We see a woman covering herself very much like the picture we had just seen. Another Eve-like figure, or maybe even a Venus-like figure, reworked in this particular piece. Again, he doesn't really give us much to go on when we're trying to interpret it, just simply the name in Polynesian, Delectable Waters. Here, the last year of his life in 1903, we see him reworking the Eve figure, as well as the two figures behind her, as well as the seated figures, all kind of coming back together into this work. They're placed deep into the woods in these very unrealistic colors. We see references to mainstream European Christianity in the background, but the suggestions here, of course, that something else is going on as well. So I hope this begins to clarify this massive picture by Gauguin, not only its importance to him and his career from this point forward, but also some of the meaning that lies behind it, which, again, I don't think he wants to tie down